Hey, good morning, SBC 205. This is your semester review in preparation for your final exam, which will be coming up next week. This is being recorded on November 30th at about 10:30 in the morning. We all know that November 30th is, of course, St. Andrew's Day, where we traditionally celebrate the Feast of St. Andrews. It is also St. Andrew's Day in Scotland, which is the National Day of Scotland, which is why I'm wearing my Scottish rugby top today. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is we'll be going through all the lectures. I'll be hitting the highlights, things that I will probably be drawing test questions for. If you stick around to the very end of this taping, I'm going to give you the easy way to score your best possible score on this test. So listen all the way to the end for the big hint on how to get the best possible score on this exam, okay? These will generally run in the order that I did the lectures in class on. I'm not going to guarantee that. There may be some jumping around. But in general terms, I'm going to try to keep it to the order that we addressed them in class. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so one of the very first topic we addressed is why do we even speak in public? Okay. We hit the three general purposes for speaking: to inform, to persuade, and to entertain. Be aware of all of those. We talked about the human communication process on that in those first two lectures. We talked about what was required for human communication, the number of participants, the message, the channels, feedback, and then we went through a whole series of models of human communication, including the linear model, the interactional model, the transactional model, and dialogue theory. Okay, then we went through a more complex one that involved senders and encoding messages and all that good stuff. And then we went through my personal favorite, the helix model of communication, which stressed a couple of things. Yeah, okay. We talked about that you needed to remember human communication exists in a social context. It's irreversible. It has rules. It is that human communication is a learned behavior, and that language is arbitrary. Okay, and remember, we talked a little bit about the subject-sign relationship. We're going to talk about language, and we'll review that a little bit more in just a few minutes. We talked about ethics. We talked about ethical models. We talked about the ends justifies the means. We talked about situational ethics. We talked about credibility-centered ethics. Okay, we talked about how to be an ethical speaker, and then I gave you 5 different ways to be an ethical speaker, and then we talked about Aristotle's modes of persuasion: pathos, logos, and ethos. Okay, be aware of all of that. All right, moving on to performance apprehension. We discussed the difference between stage fright and performance apprehension, and how stage fright is not an appropriate term. Okay? We talked about some of the symptoms of performance apprehension. We talked about several causes of performance apprehension, including biological, previous experiences, level of skill in performing in public, and then we talked about how to deal with it. And one of the things we talked about, not how to deal with it, was consuming alcohol. Don't do that. But we did talk about develop a communication versus a performance frame of mind. We talked about relaxation exercises. And then we talked about cognitive restructuring. Then specifically, I gave you a list of things to do, which included prepare, have presentation aids, practice out loud and in front of people when possible, dress appropriately so you're not concerned about your dress. Focus on your message and not on yourself. Remember, it's going to be get better fairly soon, because we'll talk, the stages. And then let your nonverbals convince yourself. Remember, we talked a lot about Amy Cuddy. We watched Amy Cuddy's speech from her TED Talk about fake it till you make it. Okay, and then we spent a lot of time on this, the stages of performance apprehension. Okay, Be familiar with the 3 stages of performance apprehension. Okay? Moving along to the audience. I quoted Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House of Representatives, who said, "In America, all politics are local." Remember why I said that and why he said that. Okay, the first thing we talked about is being tuned into the audience. And then we said you have to demonstrate relevance to the audience based on timeliness, proximity, and personal impact to the audience. Okay? We talked about identifying the initial audience disposition, which is where the audience is when you start the speech. We talked about methods of finding that, our methods of audience analysis, which included demographic, psychographic, situational analysis, or purpose-oriented analysis. And those were the four. Let me break that down again. Demographic, psychographic, situational, and purpose-oriented. Yep. And then we talked about sources of data for audience analysis. And then we talked about how to demonstrate credibility, because your credibility will identify your ultimate success. Okay? And then we talked about, lastly on that, and when we talked about the audience, we talked about audience adaptation. Okay, just making a note of what we didn't cover in class in minutes. Okay, then we moved to choosing your topic. And one of the things we said about choosing the topic is this is the very first instance where you begin to take control of your speech. Okay, because you're the person who selects the topic. Somebody may give you a general, broad outline, but you're the person who's going to determine exactly where you take this speech. Okay, so it's the first chance you get to take control of the speaking event. There are three things that you should consider when choosing your topic, and they were the speaker, the occasion, and the audience. Know some of the details of what you should think about with each of those. Remember that in picking the purpose of your speech, there are three main purposes. Again, going to reinforce that: to entertain, to inform, and to persuade. And we'll talk about, persuasion was create a new attitude, change an existing attitude, change existing attitude's intensity, get a behavioral response, and we'll talk about that again when we get to persuasive speaking. And then we talked about find your specific, and then we broke down some things where if voting is the general topic, general subject, and the purpose is to entertain, the varying, what would your specific purpose be in that instance? Okay? All right. Then we're on to organizing your speech. Okay? In organizing your speech, we discussed that organizing your speech increases comprehension, and that's been an idea since Cicero spoke in Rome, and then we went over some specific evidence about comprehension and organization and how they're directly tied. Okay, then we had that nice quote from Michael Kepper, who said, "A speech without structure is like a human body without a skeleton." We went over ways to organize your speech. We talked about chronological, narrative order, topic order, spatial patterns, causal patterns, problem solution, and the motivated sequence. So if I gave you an example of, two sentences on how a speaker was organizing his speech and laying it out, you should be able to identify which of those which he was using to develop his speech. Okay? Then we talked about outlining, and I went through an outline with you, and I gave you the main purposes why we outline. We outlined to test the scope of content. The main reason we outline is so that you can visualize the speech. But specifically, we do it to test the scope of the content, to test the logical relation of the main points, to test your supporting ideas, to test the balance and proportionality of the speech, and assist in the development of your notes. Okay? And then we said, as always, our rule concerning note cards: never write your speech out on your note cards. All right, then we talked about evidence. Okay? I gave you 6 different reasons why we cite evidence in a speech. We talked about when to use evidence, how to use evidence, and then we talked about types of evidence. And those included the opinions of others, statistics, and factual data. And we talked about the definition of each of those, and we talked about the differences in each of those. We talked about the sources of evidence, which included personal knowledge, primary research, and secondary research. Know the difference in all of those. And then we talked about some guidelines for using evidence. Use a variety of types of evidence. Choose appropriate forms of evidence. Make sure your evidence is relevant. Don't use too much, and then don't manipulate your evidence. Okay? And we also said, well, missed one, use evidence that is unfamiliar. All right. Then we talked about methods of presentation, and we hit 4. Reading from a manuscript, speaking from memory, impromptu speaking, and extemporaneous. And remember, extemporaneous is the one we used in class. Then we talked about delivery. Okay. We talked about how a good speaker has better retention in the audience. We talked about a whole lot of research on why delivery is important. Okay. We talked about how to write your notes. We talked about, holding your notes naturally, never write, notes should trigger recall and not contain the actual text. And then we talked about do not write your entire speech on your note cards again and again and again. Then we talked about some nonverbals. We talked about the characteristics of the voice, including pitch, volume, rate, and quality. We talked about that variety is the need for, is the most important thing in the characteristics of the voice. We talked about focusing on articulation. And again, that's how you pronounce individual words and is not associated with a regional dialect, but ensuring that you interrupt the outward flow of air. So know what articulation is. We talked about the vocalized pause. Then we talked about physical delivery. So remember, nonverbal communication breaks down into vocal communication and then physical delivery. And in that, we talked about eye contact, posture, movement. Okay? And those were the key things there: eye contact, posture, and movement. Then we talked about some other things like close. Okay? And what to remember with close. All right. Moving on. Speaking to inform. Remember, the main purpose of an informative speech is to convey knowledge. Okay? We talked about why we do informative speaking. We talked about some key concepts, which included adjusting your content for each individual audience. We talked about avoiding jargon. We talked about the amount of information you present, and that you need to build on previous knowledge, be memorable, make it relevant, and be personal. Just checking. That will be the end of that. Then we talked about problem-solution speeches, and remember, the core concepts in problem-solution speeches are they're really an informative speech, but their structure is very specific. Remember, you have problems with cause and effect, and then you have solution with viability and efficacy. I wouldn't know what cause, effect, viability, and efficacy all mean and how you bring them in. And then we talked about some solutions, some examples. Okay? Language. Okay. We talked about meaning. We talked about denotative and connotative meaning. Be aware of what that is. We talked about an individual engagement with the environment will change the meaning of things. Like we all have a different interpretation of the word mother, and not only that, as we progress through our lives, our interpretation of that specific word, mother, will be different. Okay? We talked about how language and thoughts are intertwined. Okay? We talked about words are not things. We talked about sign and referent relationships. Okay? That the word is a sign and the thing that the word refers to is the referent. All right? Then I gave you 12 different ways that oral communication differs from written communication. So I would be aware of all 12 of those differences between oral and written communication. Then we talked about simile, metaphors, and hyperbole and the dangers of each and using them in spoken language. All right? Then we talked about some things you need to be aware of. Rhythm, parallelism, repetition, and alliteration. Then we said three things to remember. Adapt your language to the audience, be professional, and be inclusive. All right? And we talked about why you need to be inclusive and some ways to be inclusive. All right, closing down on the end here, almost done. We talked about persuasive speaking. We talked about the difference between coercion and persuasion. We talked about some of the obstacles to changing attitudes, selective perception, selective recall, selective exposure. I'm making a note to myself for the test. So we've got selective perception, selective recall, selective exposure, and the degree of commitment and the public commitment of the audience. All of those can be obstacles to changing attitudes. Be aware what each one of those is. We talked about methods of changing attitudes, which basically was build a case with evidence and reason. We also talked about foot in the door in the face, show your proposal is consistent with existing attitudes, and appeal to an alternative value premise. Okay. There's also two that I said we could use, but we didn't like, which was arouse fear and offer a reward or a bribe. Then we talked about styles. There was the one-sided persuasive speech and the two-sided persuasive speech. And then we talked about some organization possibilities, informative, problem solution, and then the motivated sequence. Okay? Okay, and then lastly, this is the end. All right, we talked about listening. We talked about the difference between listening and hearing. Okay, know the difference between listening and hearing. We talked about Blaine Goss's listening model from 2009 and what was really historic or really groundbreaking on Blaine Goss's listening model, and how it sort of overturned a lot of our previous thoughts about listening. We talked about the 4 stages of listening: receiving, understanding, remembering, evaluation. We talked about listening styles: people-focused, action-focused, content-focused, and time-focused. And then we talk about some of the impediments to listening: noise, receiver biases, attention spans, and then how to be a critical listener, take notes, minimize distractions, and think critically. Okay. That was really fast. We knocked that out in a little under 20 minutes, okay? But fortunately, because this is YouTube, you're going to have an opportunity to go back and rewind and listen to and then compare what I gave you as what I thought was important in the class, so you can structure all your reviews. Don't forget, I'm also going to get some questions out of the textbook that did not appear in the lecture, so go back and look at the syllabus, see what chapters you were supposed to have read. The syllabus also has the link to where the textbook is. Now, I told you that at the end I would give you the one best thing to do to score the highest score on the test, because I want everybody to successfully complete this test. So here's my trick to scoring as high as possible on the final that you may not hear from any other professor. You get your highest score on the final by answering as many questions right as you possibly can. So study is the trick to getting a high score on your final exam. Study and answer questions correctly. All right? So that's it. Happy St. Andrew's Day. If you meet a Scotsman today, make sure you wish him or her a happy St. Andrew's Day. November 30th, St. Andrew's Day. Everybody have a great time. I will be available in email, and I guess finals start on Tuesday. So we will see you with final.